Hi, my name is Shannon Timchula. I'm the owner and creator over at Knotted Threads Co. Recently, I've released my first PDF pattern called the Gaia Crossbody. In that PDF pattern, you'll see that I make these two bags right here. In this video companion tutorial, you'll watch me create this one right here. In both the PDF pattern and this video tutorial, I hope to offer you detailed instructions that take you step by step with little tips and tricks along the way to complete your gorgeous Gaia crossbody. I hope you find this helpful, and I promise my awkwardness dies down a little bit after about the first 10 or 15 minutes. Happy sewing! You should have already fused your stabilizers and interfacings to all of the relevant pieces as instructed in the pattern. The first step in your process will be prep work. There's a lot of it, but I've tried to make it easy on you by providing full-size pattern pieces with center lines down all the applicable pieces. This should make it easy. You just place the pattern piece on top of your cut piece and you mark accordingly. I state in the pattern that I personally mark both sides of my centers. I like to do it this way because in case I accidentally remove my removable ink mark, I still have my ink pen mark on the wrong side. Either way, I always keep them within the seam allowance. In the pattern, you have two front pocket options. You have a dual slip pocket that is sewn down the center and riveted in place at the top, or you can have a single large slip pocket with a magnetic enclosure to secure it. In the pattern, I give you detailed instructions on using a basic magnet. I believe these are 18 millimeters in width, and they're your common one that you can find anywhere. But since I have the opportunity now, I'm going to show you how to alter the placement of your magnet for use of custom magnets or specialty locks in place of the basic hidden magnet. For the hardware, you should cut your zippers down to the lengths instructed in the pattern. This will be my main zipper, and these will be the zipper pockets. If you are having a webbing backed strap, you need to cut your webbing to the width of your fabric, which is typically between 52 and 55 inches. You are welcome to upgrade your strap to 1.5 inches wide, but for the tutorial we're going to stick with 1 inch as the pattern calls. If you are going to upgrade your strap, I do not recommend upgrading your D-rings to 1.5 inches as well. It's best to just leave these at 1 inch because it fits perfectly in the gusset of the bag. You'll also need 3 pulls, a zipper end, and any extras that you want to add in. I always like to add in a nice little handmade tag, a snarky tag, and of course my cork logo labels. The next step is creating the D-ring connectors. You will need all 4 pieces of your D-ring connectors. This one I've already completed. The first step is to separate them into 2 pairs. And then you'll apply double-sided tape to the wrong side of one of those halves of the pair. The important thing is to keep it out of your seam allowance so that you don't stitch over the very strong double-sided tape. But then you want to align them wrong sides together as perfectly as you can. If you aren't going to edge paint this, you really need to be as particular as you can because you'll be able to see this raw edge from the exterior of the bag. It's a little finicky sometimes, but if you take the time, you get way better results. Once you are done putting them together, take both pieces to the sewing machine, and we're going to stitch between 1/8 of an inch and 1/16 of an inch from the outside edge of these peanut shapes. You'll see that as I sew, I will pivot around every curve, and this is so that I can really follow the exact curve of the piece that I'm stitching. At about this point, I like to reach in and just pull my bottom thread through. And leave this hanging out there until I'm done stitching. So now I'm meeting where I started my top stitching, so I'm just kind of slowly hand cranking into that same hole or very close to it. And then I'm just bringing my needle all the way up and pulling it out. I'm leaving long tails, and then I will pull them through to the back side and knot and trim my threads. Don't do that. Okay, that's fine. I pulled the wrong one through because, of course, I'm recording and those are the kind of mistakes you use or that you'd make. So now you can see I have a stitch that is no longer there, but I'm going to call it a day. I have that power to do that, and so do you. So I like to double knot. So I do 1, 2, and then I do 3 for good measure because I'm slightly meticulous. Okay. And because I'm using bonded thread, I can melt my threads down. If you have a thread zapper, that's way better than doing this. If you have vinyl or something, you would mess it up, but it's all on the back side, and you can maybe see that there is a little bit of a kind of blob of the melted thread, and that's fine. This is going to be folded on the inside. A rivet will be there, and you won't really be able to see it. You will see that gap in the stitches, but we're going to call it a day. I have this one that we just did and this one that I finished. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go and get started edge painting all of these edges, and so that I have a nice clean connector when it's time to apply those. So we're done with these for now unless you're edge painting, and once you finish edge painting you can just set them aside till we're almost finished with the bag. For those curious about edge painting, I just wanted to share with you that this is the brand that I use, and the kind of recipe that I like to do is 3 layers of base coat and 2 layers of color. Occasionally I will do a 3rd layer, or I will do an additional layer of like iridescent or gloss edge paint over the color when I'm done with that, but not always. It just depends on the material that I'm working with. This is silicone, and one of the nice things about silicone or the Sileather is that I can just wipe off any excess edge paint that that accidentally may get on the top or the bottom, and so that's really helpful. It makes the process a lot faster. But if you're doing something like a colored cork or a really sensitive vinyl, you may want to be a bit more careful than I just was, because you can't necessarily wipe it off all the time. But that's what I do. So that right there was my first coat on for both of those pieces. So I will, as we work our way through the bag, I will be coming back and adding on additional layers and sanding as I need to, and then they should be ready by the time we are installing the D-ring connectors on the bag. If you are opting to edge coat additional pieces, these, just keep in mind that these will all be single layer, and not everyone has the same recipe for single layer edge paint as they do for maybe like 2 layers. I am one of those people. You can edge paint to your own preference, but for me, because all these are lying flush up against the bag and no one's really seeing that edge super closely, I just like to do a single layer of base coat and a single layer of the color, and to me that's enough for what I need for this purpose. And it's also pretty difficult to edge paint a single layer that's flimsy like this before you apply it on the bag. But if you are going to edge paint them, now is a good time to do that so that your overlays are dry and before you go to install them, which is pretty early in the process. And then this will be your binding and your slip pocket trim. So these can wait if you get burnt out on edge painting. These can wait a little bit later, but you definitely want to get the overlays done early as well as the connectors. After you've completed your D-ring connectors and you've at least got your first layer of edge paint on there and you're ready to move on to the next step, you want to grab your 2 zipper pocket linings and your 2 8-inch pieces of zipper tape that you've already cut. If you haven't already singed the edges of your zippers, melt them just a little bit to reduce any fraying and prevent it going forward. Just a little bit does the job. So take one set and set it aside, and then the other set we're going to baste right side up, zipper right side up on the top. We're going to baste at 1/8 of an inch here, and then I will bring it this side back up and baste the other side as well. So then, like I said, we're going to bring this up to meet this edge, like this, and then we will stitch 1/8 of an inch along that top edge. After you complete this set of zipper pocket lining and zipper tape, then you're going to want to do the other pair as well. Okay, so for now, if you want, sometimes I find this easier if I'm having a hard time lining these up under my overlays in the next step, but you can do this now, is you can, if you have a preference as to way your teeth points, I like to have the curve of my teeth pointing to the left. It's something that, I don't know why, but I have that preference. So what I would do is I would take this to my ironing area and I would iron this seam here flat so that when later on I go to lay it on top, I'm not having this seam poke up. It helps sometimes, but that's totally optional and only if you're struggling getting your overlay aligned over your teeth properly. The next step will be applying double-sided tape to the back of your zipper overlays. You want it centered and centered along the top and bottom of kind of both halves. So the important thing is to keep it about 1/8 of an inch between the edges. You don't want to catch it in your stitching, so doing that should give you room. So you see how I caught it right there. I'm just going to rip that off. Now, taking one of your main body panels, we'll remove the double-sided tape from one edge. If you feel pretty confident that you can get this centered evenly without removing one side first, you're welcome to do that. Just take it and line it up with your the line that you drew. So I'll remove the second strip. And again, just following the line that I drew. You're going to repeat that for the second panel. So one will be your front and one will be your back, obviously. And you just will be applying it the same way for both. Now we will take this to the sewing machine and we will stitch between a 1/16 of an inch and an 1/8 of an inch around this outside edge. Just like we did on the D-ring connectors, we're not going to back stitch. We're going to start with long tails. My preference is this corner right here, and then we'll stitch all the way around. Try to end in the same hole you started in, and then leave long tails. Remember, before you get back to the hole that you started in, you're going to want to pull the threads to the back of your fabric so that you can knot them properly. Again, starting with long tails. Make sure you've got your top stitching stitch length set, and then just get started. As I get closer to the end, I've already pulled my threads to the back, and I just need to try and get my needle to go into the same hole that I started in, which isn't too difficult, but you may need to have a slightly longer stitch or maybe make 2 slightly shorter stitches leading up to your beginning stitch hole, and that way it looks a little bit more natural. If you aren't using bonded nylon, I would recommend putting a little dab of glue or fray check on the knot after you're done, not necessarily burning it because it won't melt effectively and you could risk burning the threads or in the stitches to the left and right of your knot, and then you have lost any security to that stitch and you'll have to redo it. The next step will be to trim away the main panel only from the inside of this stitch line. You want to leave about an 1/8 of an inch gap. It's pretty narrow, but the main support from the stitching is going to be when you stitch the zipper to this box, not necessarily from this. But if you leave all of this here, you're going to get a very bulky area now that you have added, well, once you add on the zipper and the zipper pocket lining. And what that would do is push out your zipper overlay, and it would look a little funny. So this is why we do it this way. So you just need to cut inside the box. Sileather is not the easiest thing to cut, and I have bulked it up a bit with interfacing, but you want to cut along the center in the box, and I like to poke my scissors just behind the zipper overlay, maybe about 1/4 of an inch, and cut through. So there's my cut. Just have to be very careful you don't cut into your overlay. If at some point during this process you cut into your overlay, I highly suggest that you take your overlay off, cut a new one, get it ready, and redo this process before you lose this box, before you cut away from this circle, because you're going to have a lot harder time matching everything up without that rectangle and with so much of the main panel missing. So you can ruin one small thing without ruining the whole big important thing. So with that being said, then I like to try to keep my double-sided tape on my overlay so that I can use it when applying my zipper. It doesn't always happen, but it's worth it to try. So, and not all materials are going to release from the double-sided tape as easily as the leather does, but you do need to release them because you want to be able to cut further into the main panel than the double-sided tape allows you to if they're still adhered together. So once you do that, start trimming away. If you have duckbill scissors and you want to, you can trim down this bit of bulk that you get from the fusible fleece. I didn't put this in the pattern, and only because it's quite finicky to do, and it's not really necessary, but I like to do that. It's just my personal preference, not necessarily a need. And duckbill scissors, not everyone has. I'm not cutting the Sileather or like the vinyl or anything. I'm only cutting away the fleece and the woven interfacing that's on top of it. Now that we have done this, the next step will be to take one of your zipper panels or your zipper pocket lining, and you will, I like to put both fingers on each side like this. I'll move this. There we go. And I like to kind of feel how much space I have on either one. So I try to kind of place either side of the zipper on either side of my knuckles. Try to match it up a little bit. If you need to reapply double-sided tape, you can do that. If you weren't able to keep it on your overlay, you will definitely need to do that again. But I am just going to eyeball this for now and then adjust as I need to. So what you want is about from the edge of this opening here, you want to have between 1 inch and 3/4 of an inch. So if we're going to use the ruler, we'll check it out. So just about 3/4 of an inch. Just about slightly over, but that's fine. The goal is to make sure that we don't have anything less than like 1/2 of an inch on either one side, because it'll push it too far to either side of the panel and make it more difficult to just kind of maneuver things and potentially stitch down the side. Okay, so now what you want to do is move the zipper pocket lining up to the top of your bag like this and clip it in place. You don't want to be stitching through the part through the actual pocket. You want to be stitching just down here. And then once we make that stitch line, we'll fold it down and we'll continue stitching the top. So, starting about 1/8 of an inch behind this box so that we have enough space when we finish our last top stitching of this box, we can meet it down properly. So we'll do 1/8 of an inch before and 1/8 of an inch after. I like to switch to my zipper foot for this step. And from this edge of my zipper foot to the needle is about the space that I work with when I do this. Again, this is all my personal preference, and 1/8 of an inch is totally fine for this process. Once you get towards the end, it's good to just verify where your needle is going to end up. If you need to, push it just a little bit further to get about that 1/8 of an inch past that window. Pull it through to the back, leave yourself tails, and we're going to knot it and melt those knots. Now, you can either finger press this part down, or you can take it to the iron. My preference is to take it to the iron and get it super flat. So that's what I'm going to do. So I've just taken this to the ironing board and I have pressed this nice and flat. This will just make everything just that much more smooth to work with. Before I top stitch these 3 edges of the box, I want to make sure that I'm happy with everything and I don't need to adjust my overlay at all. So before you get started stitching this line, you want to grab a zipper pull. This is the one that will be going on this one, and we get started. We're going to do the same thing we did here on this one. Leave long tails, start, go down, pivot, go all the way to about halfway. Then we're going to insert the zipper pull on, and then finish, leave long tails, knot both, and we're done. Tip to getting a nice corner with your thread is to make sure that your needle is on the way back up to your machine before you continue on. So now I'm at the point, just about my halfway point, where I want to install my zipper. I find it easiest if I pivot it away from me, and then I lift it up, pivot it away, and install it that way versus trying to push it on right here. But let's see if I can show you. Before you install it, you want to look at the teeth. And the tooth, the side that has a tooth furthest out is the one that you really want to make sure goes into the zipper first. And that way you have a nice clean zipper with no strange bulge at the end when you close it. So you might need to separate it about 1 inch. And put it on. Okay, just to show you again from the angle that I see, I push it on through the back. And you want to get that edge to be just like it was before, flat and flush, okay? So then you push it on, and then push it through. Keep zipping it all the way closed. And press this down again. Put your foot down and keep going. And I ended in the same hole I started with and leaving long tails. Okay, so you see we're pretty much even on either side. This one is a little bit more than this one, but it's still doable and it's not going to interfere with me sewing the sides of the bag. So now we're going to take it and push this side back and stitch down here using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And there you go. That is a completed zipper pocket with your back completely closed up. You trim any threads that you have. You can press it one more time nice and flat if you haven't already. And then you repeat this whole process for the other main body panel. After you've completed your zipper overlays, both of them should be fully completed. You want to just pull your front panel. This is your front main body panel. You'll also need your 2 front pocket pieces, the lining and the exterior. We're going to go to the sewing machine and we're just going to put these right sides together and stitch along the top at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, making sure that we backstitch on both ends. So now that I've stitched the top of this, again, right sides together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, it's going to be time to trim this with pinking shears. Now, I don't know about you, but I've never really had a good pair of pinking shears, so it can be a little difficult depending on the material you choose. But just stick with it. It really makes this seam nice and smooth. Now that you're done trimming with your pinking shears, you want to turn this right sides or wrong sides together and press this at the machine if you can. If you can't, then you're probably going to need to really clip it nice and flat if you can't press with an iron. Rolling, using your fingers to roll that seam as evenly as you can. Now that you have pressed this top edge nice and flat, take it to your machine and top stitch using a 1/8 inch seam allowance along this edge. Before we start in on showing you how to install this magnet onto the front pocket, we're going to talk about what we do to get the normal magnet installation going. So in the prep work, you should have transferred your magnet markings from your main body panel and from your front pocket pattern pieces. From there, you should have also marked the centers so that you know, so you can line everything up perfectly. You should have also fused a piece of Decoville light between the woven interfacing and the washer and prongs. So the layers would go fabric, woven interfacing, Decoville light scrap, washer and prongs, and Decoville light scrap, so that you protect your exterior fabric from wearing over time with those magnets and you support this fabric. We don't need a ton of structure and bulk to this piece. What we need is to support this magnet. So that's why I've had it, that's why I wrote it the way I did with just using a Decoville light scrap. You don't need to beef up this whole front pocket because it's still relatively flush, even though it's not super snug up against the bag. You just don't want to add a ton of bulk into the pocket because 1, you're going to have to top stitch that later, and 2, it's just unnecessary. So once you have installed your male portion onto your pocket and your female portion has been installed onto your main body panel, you would then clasp those together, match up the bottom center markings, and then clip around the sides. Your front pocket is wider than your main body panel. And this is so that when you match them up, these flat edges up, and you top stitch it down, it will, or I'm sorry, when you catch it in the seam, when you turn that seam, it's going to be flush with the bag, and it won't cause the buckle that you see a lot with pockets like this. So make sure that you match up these edges nice and flush when you go to clip. If you're doing the dual slip pocket option for the front pocket, it's fairly simple compared to the magnet, because all you really need to do is sew this top edge, top stitch this top edge, and then match up all your guidelines that you did in your prep work. So in the prep work, you were to fold your pattern piece down. There's actually this horizontal line there that is your little guide to do it. You line it up on your main body panel, and you just make a short vertical line. As you can see, that stays below the top of the pocket, so you're not going to see it on your main body panel when your bag is finished. But it is necessary because you were also instructed to draw a vertical line down the center of your front pocket. So once you have matched up your bottom center, after you've done your top sewing and your top stitching up here, and just like in the magnet option, you match up your marks down in the bottom, and you would clip it around and baste it on. From that point, you would take that line that you drew down the center of the pocket and the short line that you made on your main body panel. Taking it to your sewing machine, you would stitch down this line, all the while kind of looking and holding this spot down with your finger so that it stays nice and centered on the bag. Then you would stop stitching about 1/8 of an inch or so before you would hit this top stitching line, which gives you just enough room to carefully poke a hole and set a rivet. Now, the only other thing that I suggest doing is to put a little piece of Decoville light there so that you can further support that rivet. I don't believe that you need it, but for the most part, but people love to test the limits of bags. So I always like to add just that little bit of extra security just in case. So if you were going to use something different than the basic magnet called for in the pattern, such as a custom magnet or something just like a decorative magnet like this, you're going to need to kind of wing it. But it's not impossible. I've done it, and it looks really great when you do it. So even more of an excuse to keep buying those pretties. So what I first do is I'll line up this bottom here to match up the bottom centers. And then I will take my pocket piece and find the center, which I've already done, right there. And I'm not really worried about that because I know that that's going to be covered by this magnet. If I was using a different style of magnet where it was not going to be right there, I would not be marking on the material right there. I would be I would be using the bottom holes. Let's say if I had a heart shape, I would rub some chalk or water or heat erasable pen or something on the bottom of the metal to kind of get those holes that I need to punch in my front pocket so they could be translated onto the bag easily without it being off. So I know that when I punch the holes, it will fit perfectly. So you'll have to just play with that, but don't be afraid to get creative with it. It's a lot of fun. So I've marked my center there. I know I have my center down here. As I said before, the main panel is wider, so you just need to make sure that you keep that in mind. And then you would need to take the magnet that you have, and you need to first verify that 1, it's going to work through the thickness of the material you're using, and 2, if it's too thick for the material that you're using, you need to beef it up a little bit more. And that's where you might want to add in some heavy duty interfacing or other stabilizers kind of just in the area of where your magnet is going to be, not only to further support the magnet, but so that you don't have a lot of movement going around between like a thin material and a beefy piece of hardware. So I'm going to transfer this mark again because I know I'm going to be covering it up. I don't mind using a regular pen, and I'm going to do this. Let's just draw a line. And I have not used this magnet in this way before, so we're going down this journey together. So I am pretty certain that I'm not going to have a big issue with bulk here. I think that this is a fairly decent size magnet for my purposes. But I do want to get out this magnet here because I want to use this hole to my advantage. So I'm going to line up that hole perfectly with that center line I just created. And I'm going to see if my pen will fit through here. I don't think that it does. Okay, so what you're seeing here is that there's a pretty good amount of space between the magnet edge and the pocket, and we want to remedy that because, like I said before, we don't want a ton of movement, because what will happen then is, one, we're going to have to put a lot of glue in there and rely mostly on the glue, but also we don't want to put any extra stress on the screws that are going to help assist us in keeping the magnet in place. Normally there are casings that the screws will enter into, and that casing is where you punch your hole, and that hole around the casing is what keeps your magnet in place. This one's a little different. You're relying more on screws than you are on casings. So you want to make sure that your fabric is really snug inside the magnet. So I'm going to take my Decoville light pieces and I'm going to take them to the iron, and I'm going to probably trim away some of this to match the curve, and I'm going to butt it up there a couple. I'm probably going to put 2 layers of Decoville light there and just see how much I can beef up that little section, and we'll check back. Okay, so I had to use 2 layers of Decoville light on the lining, a layer of Decoville light on the exterior, and I did a little layer of fusible fleece in between both of those to really beef it up. As you can see, this is not quite this is maybe like 3/16 of an inch thick, and definitely needed that, but now it's nice and snug and really comfortable on there. So we still want to put the marks for the holes, or for the where we'll, again, we're doing this together, so I'm actually not punching holes. So I am welcome to glue this now without really worrying about marking holes. I'm so used to doing that with custom magnets that it just didn't even occur to me that I didn't have to do that. So I'm going to put a little bit of glue here, not a lot, a little bit of glue here, again, not a lot. We don't want this to be oozing out, but we do want to get that glue on there so that it will stay on the bag. The glue is going to be your primary source of support on here, and these screws are definitely secondary. Let me find where I have my little line. I lost it. There it is. Okay. I'm sure I made a bunch of people cringe just then. Again, we don't want the ooze, but I've got the ooze, so we're going to have to wipe away the ooze. Okay. It's a good thing about getting the right kind of glue for bag making is that something like this happens, you can rub stuff right off of your hardware, and it's not going to leave a lasting mark. Fabric's a little bit different. It's a little harder to wipe it off of fabric, but once it's on there, we're good to go. I need to verify one more time for my own sanity. Okay, so now we've got that on there, and I am going to also do a, get that glue off. This is my rag that I use for edge painting. Oh my gosh. This is a professional video, everybody. Okay, so glue, first glue, is going to go into this hole. So I can screw that magnet back in comfortably, and we know it's not going anywhere. Then I'm going to put a little bit of glue in these holes. Really have to be neat with it because as neat as you can if you don't have good glue. Then we will screw in these screws. Voila! The top half of the magnet is installed. I'm going to wipe off the glue and let it dry for a little bit. While we're waiting on that to dry, we're going to mark the center area for the magnet placement. So I know that this line right here, because we just noticed that with the slip pocket, I know that that line right there is lower than the magnet, lower than the top edge of the front pocket. So I'm just going to make a little line there. And now I know that's centered. And so from there, when I do my next bit, I can figure out exactly where I need to place my magnet. Okay, now that we have let the glue dry, I did go in and trim away a little bit of the Decoville light and fusible fleece from that dipped a little bit lower than the magnet, just so that it doesn't show so much through this really soft faux leather. So now that I have my center lined up and I know my magnet is centered, I can see, let's see if I can make you see. It matches up perfectly, which is what we want. And it just so happens, that was really lucky, that white mark that I made is actually perfectly centered. That never happens. So what I'm doing right now is making like a puddle of this ink, and I'm going to press the magnet down and just see where that ink transfers to the thing. So it's slightly higher than where the magnet needs to go. So I'm going to transfer my lines right here. I'm going to do another puddle. See what happens. Hope you could have seen all that. Again, professional video tutorial here. Yeah, so you can actually see the marks of the screw right there in the middle. So I believe that's good. We're going to go for it. So I will poke a hole, and then I'm going to grab my Decoville light scrap, another one, since I used them all on the front pocket. I'll grab another scrap, and I will place that in there to further support this magnet, and then we'll see how it all fits together and hope I didn't just ruin a front panel. Okay, I got a scrap of Decoville light. I'm going to just transfer my lines there, punch the holes in that, through and press it down. Then I'm going to take another layer of Deco Build just because I want to, and show you how I fuse it over the top of the piece like I did for the magnet. And so I'm just going to fuse that right on top. I'm going to take it to the machine and I'll be right back. I did not take it to the machine, I took it to the iron, but I have just fused it right over there, and so that is not going to mess with anything else. It's going to be nice and happy there, and we're going to see what happens for the moment of truth. There we go. Lines up just well. So now I'm going to clip around the edges, matching up the curves, and I'm just going to bring in these edges to the side so that it's nice and flush. So then you would just take it to your machine, and using 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, you would baste around this outside edge. So now I have basted the front pocket onto the main body panel. At this point, this main body panel is at the same point that all of your other finished main body panels would be if you use the regular magnet option or the dual slip pocket. The only thing that I want to note about using a custom magnet or lock before we move on to the next step is that if you're using a really bulky magnet that's kind of centered in the front, the more bulky that magnet is, the more it's going to push that main or that front pocket away from the main panel. And what that's going to do is that's going to take away from the kind of perfect front pocket that you have going on. And so what you want to do if that happens is maybe you would line up just like we did before where you want your magnet to be and drop it down just a hair or two. That way your magnet is going to kind of push down slightly, but you're going to get, right at this moment it would be pushed down slightly, so you get a slight bulge down here. But when you go to top stitch, you sew the gusset on and then top stitch that gusset, you're going to kind of have the same effect that you have with the sides of the pocket on the bag, where you're going to kind of give yourself just a little bit of extra room to accommodate that magnet. Unfortunately, because every custom magnet is different, not only in size but in the thickness that it accommodates, there really isn't much of a foolproof way to do this. You just kind of have to try and hope for the best and do it kind of like I showed you. So I just wanted to make that remark before we moved on. But now that we have completed our front panel, I've added in my little handmade tag where I like to put that. That's just my personal preference, and I don't include that in the pattern. But we're going to take our two gusset pieces, we're going to place them right sides together, and we're going to stitch along this wider bottom edge using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now that we've stitched this bottom edge here, making sure to back stitch, it's going to be time to trim away some of this bulk. It's not going to trim away all of the bulk from your stitching, but it does help reduce it, and that's always the goal, is to reduce and grade your bulk so that on every curve that you can have at least the smoothest fold you can. So when I say to trim the corners from your seams, it's just going in at an angle like that, kind of hitting it from about a 1/8 inch and then kind of make it to be a corner. Then I'll be taking it to the machine and top stitching that seam flat 1/8 of an inch away from either side of the seam. Okay, we've just top stitched this seam nice and flat. So now it's going to be time to get your gusset onto your main panel, your front main panel. Now's the time to get your stapler. You can definitely use clips. I just find that stapling because it's a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and that's, you know, you really need the accuracy. I found stapling to be the most effective, but I totally understand if you can't use a stapler. Totally fine. You can still get the same effect with clips. So first thing I'm going to do is, because I had lost my center line on my front pocket, I'm going to transfer that from the back piece towards the front again, just so I have that for reference. That's why I like to keep pen on the back side and removable, like ink pen on the back side and removable ink pen on the front. I guess I could say ballpoint pen. So what I'm going to do is match up that seam with that center line, and I'm going to staple it. Staple it at about 1/8 of an inch. And then I will continue on that straight path just a little bit further, again at about 1/8 of an inch. It's kind of like pre-basting, and then we will baste. If you've got a long zipper pull like this, what I like to do is unzip it, tuck the pull in, and zip it closed, and that'll keep it out of the way. So we will clip up top now. Make sure you're lined up, you have everything nice and lined up. Do the other top edge. You can clip this out of the way if you are worried about accidentally sewing it. You can clip it up just about there. My pull is affecting my ability to fold the fabric, so let's see if we can manipulate it a little bit more. So you can clip it like this, just like we did before when doing the front pocket if you like. I typically don't have an issue with it getting caught in the seams, but you know, always better safe than sorry. So we will continue to clip along this straight edge here. I'm going to leave kind of, once you get to where your fabric wants to start pulling away from that curve, stop stapling. So now is when we need to start clipping or snipping into our gusset just a little bit. So the reason why your gusset is shorter than your, you need to clip it to get the good curve around your bend. It's just because if it's too loose, you're going to start getting puckers, and we don't want the puckers. We want a nice clean curve. So you want to make it slightly shorter and then clip it to help the curve expand and fill out, or help the gusset expand and fill out into that curve. So what you want is to, if you need to draw a line beforehand, totally fine. You might need to do that. I have done this a number of times, so I'm pretty good at clipping about 1/8 of an inch. And I do it maybe about 1/4 of an inch apart from each snip. And then, like I said, no more than 1/8 inch deep is about all you need. And kind of just do it in the middle of that open area that you did not staple. And then you're just going to just press it into that curve, and you'll see that it expands just a little bit, and that little bit of expansion is what you need. That's all you need, and you just need to staple it from there. But because we've already clipped the straight edges, we know that this curve being expanded in the way that it is going to be even. You're not going to get anything strange unless you didn't clip and kind of from the center outwards and then from the top down. And if you feel like your gusset won't fill into your curve, then you want to double check that, one, you sewed your gusset seam together at a 1/4 inch seam allowance accurately, and two, that you stapled with everything nice and flat and you didn't kind of pull on anything and leave any bubbles anywhere. You kind of just have to go back and double check your work. And if you have any staples that are poking out like that, you want to grab your pliers or a tool to crimp them down, because that will get caught in your machine. And then nobody's having fun when that happens. A happy little curve right there. Even when you're clipping, you still want to follow the same guide of starting from the center, working your way out of the bottom, and then going back up to the top and working your way down, and then tackling the curve. You still want to do that. Now that you have everything stapled, you will take it to, stapled or clipped, you'll take it to the machine, and so starting from one edge, my preference is always the top right edge, and so all the way around using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Make sure that you are backstitching on either end. If you feel more comfortable, definitely backstitch over your pockets. Just be careful, there's a little bit of bulk depending on the material that you used for your front pocket. So just be aware of that when you're sewing over that. Also be aware of the bottom seam and the little bit of bulk that is there as well. And we'll go ahead and do that now. Before you get started, you want to have, if you use staples, you want to have a pair of pliers or something nearby to remove your staples, just in case you get to a point where you have stapled it too far into your seam. Now it's time to remove all the staples. I like to keep a magnet nearby for this purpose. Makes it a lot easier. So now what you want to do, as I state in the pattern, about 1 inch or so down, you want to cut into the main body panel, close to the seam, but not right up against the stitches. Just enough so where you can comfortably fold the seam away, and you'll see why we do that soon. The reason for clipping that seam allowance there on the main body panel is because for the rest of the bag, for the rest of the gusset, when we top stitch, we will be top stitching all of that seam allowance to the gusset. But we want to keep this seam at the top of the bag nice and flat, so we can separate that now from the rest of the seam allowance, top stitch everything else, and when we get closer towards finishing the bag, we'll have this nice flat seam up here that we can work with, versus having a bulky seam up top, which is never as easy to sew as a flat seam. So we're just kind of trying to grade that bulk as much as we can. Before we move on to top stitching the gusset, we do need to trim away some of this corner to reduce some bulk, so that when it is folded the other way, you will get a really nice even corner that doesn't have these random folds in it. That happens because there's too much fabric that is trying to fold into what is then a smaller curve. So we are going to just trim it away by cutting some darts. So now we've trimmed away some triangles. If you're like me and you're using Sileather, you probably have a cramp in your hand, but we're gonna power through. So one thing that's important to note when you start your top stitching is to move that 1 inch or so section that you have up top towards the main body panel. You really don't want to keep that in your gusset top stitching. Push that away. You're going to do it at the beginning and at the end. And I do back stitch on this seam just slightly, and I think that's important just to make sure that you don't lose your pretty top stitching to something so simple. See, that is where it needs to be. I like to start from the left side now so that I can use the guide on my foot to do my 1/8 inch top stitching. Double checking my tension, make sure everything's fine. When I tell you in the pattern you may need to slightly tug or pull on your fabric or your gusset and your main body panel apart, it's just because it's going to want to push forward onto your main body panel, so you might need to just pull it back slightly as you sew so that you get that nice even flat edge. As you get around the corner or the curve, it's going to get a little bit more difficult, and this is when you're really going to have to manipulate your bag. But always do it with your needle in the down position and just readjust every couple of stitches to make sure that you're getting as nice and even of a top stitch as you can. As you get closer to that center seam where the gusset, that center seam on the gusset, you do want to be a little careful. Again, you're going to hit some bulk. You may find that some of your machines may skip a stitch there, so you may want to just back stitch very neatly over that just in case, making sure that seam is top stitch down will really help your bag kind of sit a little flatter. Get rid of those staples. You know what I did? I almost top stitched my pocket to my bag. See, I should follow my own advice. Let's see where my stitch is. Alright, I think I'm okay. as you get closer to the end of your stitching, make sure that you move that little bit of seam allowance that you've snipped out of the way. Back stitch nicely. Whew, that was a close call with the pocket. Okay, no skip stitches, all good. So, as you can see, since we trimmed away and we top stitched down that seam right there, or those curves, we're getting a nice rounded front. We're not getting a bunch of buckles or weird shapes right there. So that's good. So now it will be time to do the same process as before with your bag, or with your back panel, and again with the stapling, centering the bottom seam, and sewing it onto the bag. So we'll go ahead and get started on that. This is one of those tasks where it never gets any easier anytime you do it. It's always kind of stressful. I like the results you get from it, but I also understand that it is not for everyone. So, and I fully admit that with the 1/4 inch seam allowance, it's really hard to catch everything when you're top stitching. Even I don't catch everything every time. Especially if you're using something like a full Sileather, full leather, a full vinyl, full cork bag, you are going to have that bulk, which is going to take away from your ability to fully catch everything in your top stitch. But I am doing that now in the video to show you that even though you may miss a couple bits in your top stitching, or even though you might have a little bit of extra bulk, you can still get a really good result. So don't stress too hard. Again, we're making sure that that seam allowance is pushed towards the main body panel when we're starting, and then the rest of it is pushed to the gusset. Adjusting with my needle in the down position, and I just have to readjust every couple of inches. Okay, now we have finished top stitching the front of the gusset and the back. As you can see, it's not going to win any awards for the straightest top stitching, but it did what I needed it to do, which is to keep that seam allowance towards the gusset, which not only gives it a more streamlined, clean look, but it also provides a little bit of extra support to the bag. We're going to press this, make it nice and smooth on the inside, re-adhere any interfacing that might have come off of your fabric while you're kind of rough handling it through the top stitching, and then we're going to get started on the lining. The next step in the process will be to prep your interior slip pocket. I instruct you in the pattern to take this piece, as you had cut and fused it already, and fold over these edges over that woven interfacing and press them nice and flat. It's not super important for your overhang fabric here to be exactly even. If you have fused your interfacing slightly to the left or right, that's fine. You have more than enough space here to get the results you need, because we will be folding this in half and then top stitching 1/8 of an inch around the edge. And we have more than enough space here on this side and on this side to accommodate that. The important thing though is to make sure that you did cut your interfacing to the correct size, because that is going to be the width of your slip pocket trim. So if you didn't cut your interfacing to the correct size and you fused it and you folded it and you go to line up your slip pocket trim and you see that your slip pocket trim is about a 1/4 inch too short or too wide, you're going to have to make some adjustments to fix that. So once you have fused you have pressed these flat, then you're going to want to fold this in half and press it again. I have pressed it nice and flat, and one thing I instruct in the pattern is to use a flat tool of sorts to make sure that you don't have any strained fold and buckling happening in these corners. And that's just so that when you get down here to pivot, you have a nice smooth pivot. You don't have some fabric bunching up instead of lying in that fold comfortably. So it's good to just kind of press it in there and make sure, and maybe press again if you need to. After we've pressed this nice and flat, we're going to take it to the machine and do a basting stitch 1/8 inch away from this raw edge. Now that we have basted this top edge and we have maybe added in a nice snarky woven tag, it's time to now mark up your slip pocket trim and apply some double-sided tape. So now I'm going to apply double-sided tape to the top right up here on the edge. I like to keep it about 1/8 of an inch from the sides, but just line it right up over top of those basting stitches that you just did, so that it stays up high and also outside of the seam allowance over here when you are going to top stitch your slip pocket onto your back. So the next step will be to remove your double-sided tape. And align it, that would be from the back side of your slip pocket, and align it with the, oh no, and align it with the slip pocket trim right along that center line you just drew. Now I do instruct in the pattern that for this sort of trim, you want to be sure at the end of this process that your back of the trim is at least equal to or greater than the front depth. And I'll explain that in a second. So I would pull off the front and then start folding this over. Sorry for the wiggles. Now here's the reason for that. If you take this to your machine and as instructed in the pattern, we're going to top stitch 1/8 of an inch away from this edge, not from this top edge. If we're going to top stitch 1/8 of an inch away from this bottom edge, we have to make sure that we're catching the bottom strip in there as well. And if we're not, then you're going to have loose binding and we don't want that. Now, it's not a big deal on your interior slip pocket. Your customers are, or you are not going to see really that this is maybe a 1/16 of an inch lower on your bag on the inside of your slip pocket. What you're going to see is that you have a really nice even top trim piece on the front of your slip pocket. Now, my canvas is not accepting this double-sided tape very well, so I'm going to clip it. But anyway, the point is that you want to make sure you're catching everything in this next top stitch. That way you're fully encasing everything that's in there, and you don't have to worry about having a loose piece of trim on the back side. So we'll just take this to the machine and top stitch about 1/8 of an inch away from this bottom edge of the slip pocket trim. So now I have just finished top stitching 1/8 of an inch away from this bottom edge. And as you can see, it's even from the top, and on the back you can see that it is slightly more than 1/8 of an inch, and that's okay. I'd rather have this security and this lower depth of the slip pocket trim on the inside versus having to redo everything, honestly. So if you want to keep messing with this until you get it to be perfectly even on either side, that is your own prerogative, but I just instruct you to do it this way, and I find it to be acceptable, and I'm pretty particular about details and stuff like that. So anyway, this part is done. So now what we will do is draw a center line on this slip pocket trim. Okay, we've grabbed our lower main lining that has this 8-inch line drawn on it, because that's the one that we're going to install the the slip pocket on. And we have applied 1/8 inch double-sided tape along the bottom 3 edges of the back side of your slip pocket. Now, I state in the pattern, and I'm just going to reiterate it here, do not use 1/4 inch double-sided tape for this, because if you do that, you're going to run the risk, or you will have double-sided tape on the inside of your pocket in the little corners, and if you're using sturdy, sticky, double-sided tape like I recommend, that's not going to go away. So definitely use 1/8 of an inch, and if you don't have 1/8 of an inch, just pin. That's your best option. So now we have removed all 3 backings from the double-sided tape. It's fully adhered. So we will take it to the machine, and starting from one edge, whichever is your preference, top stitch around the 3 bottom edges using a 1/8 inch seam allowance, making sure that you backstitch. So now we have top stitched around all 3 edges. I've backstitched and I've left tails. So I'm going to pull these tails to the back of my bag and just knot them. So now that I have knotted these tails in the back, I will be taking it to the machine, and starting from the bottom of this top stitching line, I will top stitch all the way up and stop right at or just past this top stitching line on the slip pocket trim. That's going to give me just enough space to punch my rivet, or punch my hole for my rivet and set it without breaking my thread. Okay, so we just did this line right here. As you can see, I started right at this stitch line and I ended right at this stitch line. I did back stitch and I left tails, so I will knot and melt these threads, and then I will take this to the machine and get rid of any of the markings that we've made so far. After that, it will be time to make our marks for the holes that we're going to punch for the rivets, and then set the rivets. Okay, we have now removed any of our old marking lines, and we've got all of our stitching done for our slip pocket. Technically, you could leave your slip pocket like it is and that'd be totally fine. But I do like to add the rivets here just for decorative purposes. But it also does provide just that little bit of extra security. So it's pretty easy to make these marks Most of the time I just eyeball it because I already know where it needs to go. But you want to just put it right here, right in the middle of, right next to this stitch line and in the middle of your trim. Same with here, right next to the stitch line and in the middle of your trim. And right here in the middle, but right over that stitch line. So then we're going to take these little marks and use them as our guides to punch our holes. Now that I have punched my holes in the spots that I had marked, it's time to set your rivets. But before we do that, I like to take some scraps of Decoville Light, like just tiny little squares. I'll punch a hole in the middle and then I'll fuse them right behind those holes. So I'm going to do that now. So now I have fused that Decoville Light scrap to the back of each hole, and now I will insert and set my rivets. Once you've set your rivets, your interior slip pocket is finished. The next step will be your zipper placket. You'll need both of your zipper placket pieces and your number 5 zipper tape for the main enclosure. To finish the edge of your zipper teeth, it's pretty simple. You need to undo the teeth about an inch. Then take the raw edge and fold it against the finished edge at a 45-degree angle to make a nice point. Then you'll take that whole point and fold it back on itself so that you have 3 edges lining up. 1, 2, 3. Everything should butt up nicely. You'll have this fold here butting up against the teeth, and you'll have this point here butting right up against the side. From there you would pin it in place so that you preserve that nice flush fold that you have right there. And you would take it to the sewing machine and stitch about 1/8 of an inch away from this edge just to secure it. I have stitched right here along this edge of the zipper to secure that point down, and now I have this nice edge that's going to be consistent every single time you do this. So now we have this finished zipper edge, and this will be where the zipper closes. This will be where the zipper end goes on. So when you finished attaching your zipper, it was probably still a little open. My preference is to close it back up, and it's just as simple as pressing it together with your thumbs. So we're going to set this aside for now. The next step will be to apply a little bit of double-sided tape to either short edge of your zipper plackets. So for this next part, we will remove the double-sided tape and just line it up with this 1-inch line right here. Now you'll place your zipper tape right side up on top of the right side of your zipper placket. It doesn't matter which side you start from, but it does matter that you line it up right behind that mark we just made, so that the space that it took you to make that mark is about the space that we need to accommodate the bulk of the zipper teeth. So we will then take this, you can clip it, and then we're going to baste it on the machine. As you can see from the back side, I have stitched 1/8 of an inch down just between the folded edge of the zipper placket and the teeth. The next step will be to fold over the zipper placket, match up your folded edges first, then clip along this edge. So we will then take this to the machine and sew using a zipper foot along this edge using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. So I totally forgot to record that, me stitching this. So I had just stitched this 3/8 of an inch line, and now I will go in and stitch right next to that, but just on the seam allowance side. And what that will do is relieve a little bit of the pressure. So let's say if your thread is a little bit different color than the fabric you're using, you won't see those threads poke through because I'm going to relieve a little bit of the tension off of that. Because it is a little bit of a bulky sew with the 2 pieces in the zipper and using your zipper foot. So we're going to do that one more time, again right next to it. That part is done. As you see, it was just right next to it along the edge. And so now we're going to get to the part where I instruct you on how to trim away the bulk from your zipper placket so that when you're top stitching, you have the easiest thing possible to top stitch. I know it's a little difficult as is, even after we trim the bulk, but we're going to try. The first step of removing the bulk from your zipper placket will be to pick out the stitches, the basting stitches, just 3 or 4 or so. You don't have to take all of them out. Just take them out and trim them down. Then you will trim these corners like this. And then you trim it again. You want to start cutting at about 1/8 of an inch, so around half of the seam allowance that you have here. And I like to just angle it and cut right towards that line that I drew, like that. And I do the same thing for the other side. This time I'm just angling it towards the 1/8 inch. The whole time making sure that I don't cut that zipper. I'm only cutting away the placket. So for the top, I'm going to put my zippers in, making sure I don't cut the zipper itself, and just cut and start to remove. Forgot to remove some of these stitches. I'm going to do the same thing on both sides. I'm going to poke my scissors in, not cut the zipper. I'm going to angle it towards the top till about 1/8 inch. Once I get up there, I'm going to cut it right across. Trim a little bit more away. So now what we'll have when we pull this around is we're going to have a lot less bulk in this corner, and it's going to fold quite nicely around that zipper. So this is definitely an important part of the step. You also want to trim away these corners down here, and this will help when you're sewing your zipper placket onto your lining piece. So now that you've trimmed away all your bulk, you'll then just pop it right sides together, or wrong sides together, and you'll clip. So now I will take this over to my industrial, and I will start stitching, top stitching 1/8 of an inch away from all 4 edges. And I like to start right about here on this raw edge. We have 1/2 of our zipper placket done. So just like before, we're going to align the side of the zipper along the side of the zipper placket. Reminder, we're kind of doing this opposite from before. So before, you will have laid it on this side, and basted it, but now we're going to lay it on this side and baste it. We've just finished creating the zipper placket. We've top stitched around all 4 edges and we've left everything intact. But now's the time for us to take them apart. It's very satisfying. The first thing you'll want to do is to mark the centers of these 2 pieces. Now taking your lower main lining piece with the slip pocket attached, find the zipper placket half in which the teeth go in this direction. Some might find that a little confusing in the pattern at first because there's left, rights, and when you create the zipper it points to a different direction, but what we need is this needs to be the back of the bag. And so typically in bag making, when you're looking at a bag face on, it will open from left to right. So you're looking at it from the front, it would open from left to right. So we want it to be closed and have the zipper pulled down here. So we're going to line it up this way. It is helpful for you to clip your tail out of the way. For some people who struggle with those kinds of events, I would clip it out of the way just to keep it nice and safe. Find our little center marking. Again, after some of the pressing, I've lost my removable ink line, so I'm just going to line it up with this back line. I will clip in place and then baste it. Baste this along the edge. Okay, you can see that I've basted it at 1/8 of an inch away from this raw edge. And that will keep it in place and it's still centered. I don't have to worry about it budging at all when I now sew on my upper main lining piece. So I will just clip. I just took my clip from the wrong spot. Okay, there we go. So now we will stitch along this top edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then we will repeat the whole process for the second main lining panel. Okay, we have stitched along this top edge using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So now again we will repeat that process. So now we just finished stitching our zipper placket and our upper main lining to the lower main lining, and it will be time to top stitch this at 1/8 inch. The seam allowance should be pointing down towards the main lining so that you're only getting a double dose of your lining piece and not your thicker exterior fabric. We've just finished top stitching both main lining pieces. And now we're going to take our upper gusset lining and stitch them to the top of our lower gusset linings. So that will be right sides together here at the top. So I have stitched the upper gusset lining and the lower gusset lining together using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then I went ahead and top stitched them both using a 1/8 inch seam allowance. For both of those seams, I made sure I backstitched as well as in the top stitching. And now we will take the other end of the gusset lining and we're going to stitch this bottom edge together using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then we will press it flat. After we press it flat, it's going to be time to line it up and assemble the main lining. Okay, now that we have stitched the bottom edge of the lower gusset lining, in the pattern it instructs you to trim the corners away, which I like to do just to grade any bulk, but it's not really that necessary for this part of the bag. If you are using waterproof canvas as your lining, I do suggest that you just stitch this down, top stitch it down, so that you get a nice flat gusset when you put it all together. So now that this piece is done, now we have our lining gusset piece. This is one whole unit that we're going to be using. And you just need to grab one of your main lining pieces that has already been top stitched, and you have made sure to clip your zipper tail out of the way. But before we move on, since we have had a couple people in the pattern group already mention this is a great time to just double check that your zipper placket is facing the right direction. So when it's pointing up like this, you want to make sure that you are seeing the bottom edge of the teeth. When it is pointed down like this, you should be looking at, or like sideways, I guess you could say, you should be seeing the right side of the teeth here. So hopefully that doesn't cause any more confusion, but this is the best time to fix it if you've made that issue instead of when you've constructed your lining completely. So just verify that your zipper placket is facing the right way. When you put your zipper on, your zipper should be right side up like this. Okay. So we will take our we will take our gusset and we will find our center marking here on one of our main lining pieces, and we will just line that up right there at the center. And you can clip this, or you can do the trick that I'm going to show you that's different than what I call for in the pattern, but it's another option. So in the pattern, I call for you to clip or staple this, and then also clip or staple these two edges all the way down and around. My washcloth that I use for my edge coat seeped onto the fabric a little bit. So there's that. Anywho, again, we're keeping this video as real as we can. So one thing I like to do with my lining pieces, which is, I wouldn't call it wasteful, I'm just going to say it might be considered that way for some people who don't want to use up a lot of their double-sided tape, but I like to use my 1/8 inch double-sided tape, and I just put it around the lining pieces, and I just go all the way around, and then I kind of just press it on this. It does use up a good amount of your tape, but for me, the ease of it and the speed of it is worth it. But you can absolutely get this look or get this result by using clips or staples. So now that we have applied the double-sided tape all the way around, you can remove it from your piece. So you'll just line this right up with that center marking, the center seam with the center marking. Line this up right here up top. As you see, I kind of keep it down a little bit to keep it mostly out of my seam allowance. I will line up the seams here and place a little clip just to make sure it doesn't pull up at all. You can actually do the same for the bottom, since we will be doing a little bit of manipulating, so it'll probably pull off of the lining piece. So we're going to do the same over here. Okay, so then I just press it in place. Once I've pressed it in place now, I grab the scissors and I will snip a little bit to ease the gusset into the curve of the main lining panel. Okay, so that does make it a little bit easier, but again, you are using a good amount of your tape because I do this for both sides. So it's just something to keep in mind, and it's just an alternate option. So I'm going to take this to the machine and I'm going to start out with 1/4 inch on my upper gusset lining, and then as soon as I hit this seam here, I'm just going to kind of continue on straight a little bit to bring up this seam allowance to 3/8 inch. And as I go around, it'll be 3/8 inch, 3/8 inch until I hit this lining again, and then at that point I'm going to go back to 1/4 inch and then continue on the way up, and so that both upper gusset linings will be at 1/4 inch and both lower gusset linings will be at 3/8 inch. So we'll do that and then we'll be right back. I have just finished doing my stitching, again 1/4 inch and then grade up to 3/8 inch, and now we are going to trim away some of this bulk. I use my terrible pinking shears to trim the curves. You see, this is why it's so terrible. That's the way it goes. And then I will trim the rest of the lower gusset lining down to 1/4 inch. So now we're going to repeat this process for the second main body or main lining panel. Now I have sewn and trimmed any bulk from the main lining or from the interior. So the next step is very simple. We're just going to place this inside our exterior, and I instruct you in the pattern to make sure that the back or that the slip pocket is in the back of your bag. This is the front. That's my preference, and that is just how I like to have bags oriented, but that is always, you know, that's something that you can change if you so choose to. So I'm just going to press it in there nice and flat, and I will make sure that I open up those seam allowances from before. And the one thing that I like about when I use the double-sided tape is that it does kind of help for my seams here to kind of open up and stay open against the other seams. So this one is not wanting to open for me. So there we go. So the first thing I do is match up all 4 seams, and I clip those together. And all 4 gusset seams. So I clip those together, line them up, make them nice and flush. So now that I have done the 4 seams, I like to kind of just pull it apart and make sure that when I do that, I'm getting my center linings to match up. And I'm not sure if you can see that in the video, but when I pull it apart, it's pretty much right there centered. Same here. And so that's essentially what our binding is going to do. Our binding is going to help us kind of get this to be max stretched out up top, so it's going to provide top stability, and it's going to keep it as snug as it can be. So the next step you'll need if you're using staples is to grab your stapler. Sorry about that. And you can, at 1/8 inch, staple your seams so that you don't have to leave the clips on there anymore. And always make sure that your zipper placket tail is clipped out of the way. Go. And then we will continue to staple around these other open edges to line up our lining and exterior perfectly. Okay, so now we've just finished stapling the lining and the exterior together. You should have kept your staples at about 1/8 of an inch, and you shouldn't have any puckers, and your staples should be smooth. And the reason why we want that is because if it's not smooth now and after basting, it's not going to be smooth once we apply our binding. Your lining shouldn't have had to have been stretched too far to fit your exterior. It should be comfortable. The only real bulk that you're going to encounter is going to be here in these corner seams, which we have graded a little bit by clipping away that little seam allowance there into the main panel. So once we verified everything's nice and smooth, we're going to take this to the machine and we're going to do a basting stitch around this top edge 1/4 inch. I know normally the basting is at 1/8 of an inch, but for this one we want it to be 1/4 inch. So we're going to make sure we keep our zipper plackets out of the way, and it doesn't matter if you do it from the exterior or interior, just do a basting stitch all the way around the edge. Doesn't matter where you start and stop. Now we have basted around the top edge. Before we remove our staples, we want to make sure that we're not having any puckers or wrinkles in the top of our bag. Make sure everything is nice and smooth. Trim away any threads so they don't hang down. And right now we're seeing that everything is smooth. So now we can remove our staples if you use those. Okay, double check that you have taken all your staples out. Go back in and trim any threads left from your basting. Basting stitch is going to stay in there. And the reason we did it at a 1/4 inch was to make sure that we could keep our seam allowances open at that at that level down there, closer to where our binding is going to be top stitched on. And we make sure that it kind of just gives us a little bit more stability at the point to where we're going to be stitching the binding on. So this you can now set aside. Now you need your two top binding pieces. You will be placing them right sides together and stitch each short edge using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I've stitched them together using 1/4 inch seam allowance, and now I will just kind of trim down these corners a little bit, because when we go to bend it, if we don't trim the corners, they tend to poke out a little bit. It isn't really necessary per se, but I just like to do it that way so they don't poke out, and this keeps it nice and flush. Okay, in the pattern I instruct you to draw 2 lines, and I will leave the pattern to instruct you the distance and what this gap should be. And you'll also be marking the center line. You should have also transferred your lines to the interior seam allowance of this piece. And then once you've got that done, you can set this aside. And you will place 1/4 inch seam allowance around the interior and exterior top edge of your bag. Actually, before I do that, because, and I state this in the pattern, because I do have a flatbed industrial, I do this next step, and the pretty much everything from this point on that will involve me using the sewing machine or applying tape with the bag turned inside out. Now you want to do this before you put the tape on, because if you put the tape on and you turn it inside out, the interior tape will stretch and the exterior tape will kind of pucker and fold over on itself, just from that little bit of a change of distance that the edge is kind of it's getting compressed and extended a little bit. So we're going to turn it inside out. And it's going to look a little funny, but it's okay. Then we will fold our plackets down. They're going to want to pop up here and there, so just push them back down as you need to, and then apply your double-sided tape. Make sure it's nice and adhered. And then remove the tape from the lining side or the outer side. If it's inside out, it should be the inner side. If it's right side out, outside if it's the way that I have it arranged right now. But regardless, it needs to be on your lining side. That's where we'll start. So the thing about binding is that when you're top stitching it from the exterior of the bag, you're not going to be able to really see if you're catching the lining side. So what we want is we want to make sure that we have ample amount of coverage on the lining side. So that's why we're going to apply it from the lining side down. So what might happen when you stitch everything together is that you might have a little bit extra of the binding on the interior, and that's fine. But you don't want to have too little, because at that point you're going to have to redo your whole binding. Rather have a little bit of excess than have everything short. So I'm going to find my lining, my center marking on a gusset, and I'm going to line that up with my marks here. Now I can see my line right there, so I'm going to align it with this bottom line that I drew here. I'm going to kind of stretch it a little bit, not a lot. They don't stretch a lot, but I'm just going to also line it up here on the other side. It's going to be a little uncomfortable at first, but it gets better. So lining up that center marking with the seam and kind of pressing it into that double-sided tape there. Same thing all the way around. It's just kind of feeding it through. So now I'm going to find my center marking for the main part of, or the body. Then I'm going to align that with the center line here. And then I'm going to kind of just really smooth it into place along that lower of the 2 lines that I drew on my top binding. You really want to be able to see both of those lines while you're applying it now. You want it to be aligned well, but not over, if that makes any sense. Okay, so I'm just going to ease it over, just kind of finessing it into place. Again, lining up the center marking with the center marking on the binding piece, aligning the top edge of the bag with the lower line I've drawn on my binding piece. Just kind of easing it comfortably. See how I'm kind of not really pulling it, but I'm just kind of straightening it to kind of ease out that extra, what wants to kind of fold and buckle in one place, just kind of helping it spread itself out a little bit. This is one of those jobs that's going to take some time, but if you can get it right, you're going to reap the rewards of that. Okay, now I'm just going to verify everything is how I want it. Just running my thumb along it to smooth it out as much as I can. Looking from the interior to make sure that there's no major puckering or anything like that. So now I will remove the double-sided tape backing from the exterior of the bag. So now we want to fold over our gussets. Trying to keep my tape in place. Oh my gosh. And I like to clip as I go for this, just to make sure everything stays steady. And then my tape is coming off of my silicone or my Sileather. Okay. Then I do the centers. And I'm not pressing this over really hard. I'm just kind of, what I don't want is a gap here in that fold between the edge of the bag and the material. What I want is to just comfortably fold it over. And then I'm clipping as I'm going. And that's going to serve two purposes. It's going to keep it aligned where I want it. And it's also going to give me a quick reference for making sure that my depth that the binding is dropping down is consistent. So you see, all my clips are facing the same direction. This is another reason for this is how you're going to get your quick reference guide for the depth of your binding, just by seeing how far they drop on your clips. Now, if you're using Wonder clips or just regular clips, these are not technically Wonder clips, but if you're using clips, more than likely they're 1/2 inch clips. And so that's about what you should have your binding dropping down to. So as you are placing your clips, you're butting the fold of your clip right on the top fold of your bag. And then you just double check to see that all of your clips are aligning comfortably with that bottom edge of the binding. And if you see places where they're not dipping down far enough, like maybe right here is starting to dip up a little bit, and I can see the difference between the zipper overlay and the bottom edge of the binding, you need to adjust that so that you have consistent nice binding throughout. On these 4 seams, you have more bulk. And so what you might need to do, so that you don't have a skinny binding there, is just manipulate it a little bit to make sure that the drop is even and comfortable on both sides. And that might mean picking up the binding a little bit and reapplying it a little bit more comfortably. Okay, I'm comfortable with that evenness of distance between the zipper overlay and the bottom edge of my binding. All my clips are lining up nicely, so now comes the fun part. Now we're going to take this to the machine, and from this bottom edge of the zipper, or of the top binding, we'll be top stitching 1/8 inch away from it. I'm going to start here on the gusset. I'm going to put my needle down. I'm going to back stitch a couple times, again at 1/8 inch from the bottom edge of the binding, and then I will continue to top stitch all the way around, making sure that my zipper placket is pushed down out of the way, 1/8 inch away from the bottom edge of the binding, coming back around here and back stitching again where I started. And we'll go ahead and do that now. Again, we're going to start from the gusset, and we're going to top stitch 1/8 inch away from the bottom edge of the top binding. And before I get started, I'm going to just put my foot down, put my needle in the material, and I'm going to make sure that my zipper placket is out of the way. I did forget to top stitch at the beginning, it's fine. I'm going to go over it. I forgot to back stitch. So I'm going to back stitch again, and then we'll be fine. Okay, I promise no movie magic here. I really did just take this from the machine and I plopped it over here. So just at a quick glance, I can see that my top stitching was pretty consistent just on the interior, and that's the most important part. We could see the exterior while we were top stitching, and we knew that we got a decent top stitch there because we would have stopped had we not gotten that in the middle of sewing. So you will see that you might have some discrepancies in your depth here around the corners. That's okay. It's going to be mainly missed while you're looking at it from the inside of the bag, and it's just a little bit bulkier, so that's to be expected. So now we're going to turn it right side out, which is the moment of truth where we can see how it looks as far as puckers or wrinkling or anything like that. I'll just pop it right side out. And here is the front of our bag. Now this is without any pressing or anything, and it's pretty smooth, pretty consistent. I consider that to be a job well done. So it's not too difficult. It's all in your prep work. So now that that's done, we're going to trim these threads over here. If you were like me and forgot to top stitch, you forgot to back stitch, you can knot those threads I'm not doing that because it really doesn't, it's not going to get pulled out, and I backstitched over it when I ended anyway. So I say that's fine. If you want to, now's a good time to press your bag while you don't have anything else in the way, while you have full maneuverability without the zipper end installed. It's just a really good time to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. I've just pressed the bag. I like to kind of put some steam in there first with my bigger iron, and then go in with my small dry hot iron and just press it as nice and flat as I can. And then I will stuff it and press from the outside and cover it if I need to, like use a pressing cloth, and then you're good to go. At this point, your bag itself is finished, and so now we just need to attach the D-ring connectors, put the zipper end on, and then put the zipper pull on and then put the zipper end on. So first we're going to do the D-ring connectors. Now you should have drawn your holes and punched your holes as instructed in the pattern, and then you'll need to grab your D-ring and put it onto your D-ring connector. Now I don't have you mark and punch holes on your bag here until you have done this, until you are putting it on this way, because see the difference in thickness between one D-ring and another? You're going to encounter that for various D-ring thicknesses. Not all depths of rivets will work, and so if you're wanting the rivet to sway comfortably on the bag, you'll see that you have, this bar is very thin, and so it will maybe sit more comfortably down further in the bag than this one. The rivet might need to be up maybe about 1/8 of an inch. So you kind of want to do this based on the D-ring that you have. This is a D-ring that I'm using for this bag. So I'm going to take the side that I have my knot on from when I started and stopped my stitching, and that's going to go on the inside of my bag. I'm making sure that my D-ring connector is perfectly folded and either edge is matching up, and I kind of just pinch it right there. Then I guide it right over that center seam, so we're hiding that, so it looks like one continuous binding. And then I take my pen and I double check everything centered, and then I just put a hole right in there. Don't do that. Put a hole right in there, and that's where I will punch my hole. You see it's nice and centered. Now you really want to make sure that you are setting your rivets completely. They are going to be what's supporting your strap. And if your D-rings are not, if your connectors are, the rivet isn't fully compressed down as it should be, then it's going to pop off of your bag and you're going to lose the bag from the strap. Thankfully, you know, you can always reset them later, but it's just better to make sure that everything is perfect now so that maybe your customer doesn't have that happen to them. You really need to double check it. So I'm going to go set my rivets with my rivet press, and we'll be right back. Now that our D-ring connectors are fully installed and the rivets are compressed nicely, we need to install the zipper pull and the zipper end. So you take your main zipper and just pop your pull on. You need to make sure that the end of your tape is nice and level, as if you just cut it with scissors. That's how you know when you zip it closed it will be perfectly lined up like that. Then you will fold in one side to the teeth and then fold it again behind the teeth. One side to the teeth and again behind the teeth. Put a clip on that to hold it. Grab your zipper end and some glue. Put a little bit of glue in your zipper end. It's a lot, but it will do. Insert your folded end of your tape into your pool. At this point, I kind of like to just stretch it a little bit so that those folds kind of unravel and get stuck in there versus getting stuck right behind the teeth. And find the screw that you lost. Okay, I found my screw. And then just screw it in to the back of the zipper end. These screws are very sensitive, so be careful that you don't overscrew them and strip the thread. Once you start to feel it resist, just stop. Again, I like to just kind of tug on it a little bit, and there we go. So now all that's left is the strap. For this tutorial, I had said I was going to do the webbing back strap, so that's what we're going to get started on. You will have cut your piece as designated in the pattern, and then you draw the line, the center line, all the way down the length. And then over that center line, you can either you can use whatever tape that you feel that you need to use, because you're not going to be stitching over it. I did stick to 1/4 inch and 1/8 inch in the pattern, but for straps I like to use 1/2 inch. Now that I have my tape or my line drawn and my tape applied, I'm going to start pulling off the backing to the tape and start matching the long edges to that line that I drew in the middle. Alright, now that we have finished folding our strap over, we will then apply another strip of double-sided tape down the back. Again, you can use 1/4 inch if that works for you and that's what you have. I'm just using a 1/2 inch because that's just my preference for straps and I have access to that. Okay, now you will start attaching the webbing. This is seatbelt webbing, so it is pretty thick and very sturdy. Remove the backing off your tape and just leave it centered right over the back and just pull off the tape as you go. The way I do it is I have my hand kind of just pulling the tape off the back as I glide along the strap. I'm going to take this to the machine, stitch 1/8 inch away from every edge, and then we'll be back. Okay, now it's the final step of the bag, which is applying your strap hardware and making it to be adjustable. So we just finished up stitching our strap, getting that all nice and pretty. Then, according to the pattern, I've punched the holes as instructed. And now the first step we're going to do is pick which end you want to be in your tri-glide, and then you'll insert it into your tri-glide. Then you will match up those holes and feed your rivets through. Okay, I've set my rivets in there. If you wanted to finish the ends of this, you are welcome to do that. You could have done that before all of this, which is honestly the easiest way. I tend to just go in and do it after the fact because I just want to get the strap done and made. So that's what I'll do. So the next step, or you can always pop a strap end on there. But the next step will be to then feed your your swivel snap hook through the other end that does not have the tri-glide. And you're going to want to feed it back over this folded edge. If you're doing a webbing back strap, that means that all of your webbing would be facing each other in this fold and in the fold over the tri-glide. Then you will feed it back through the tri-glide over your previous fold. Again, insert your swivel snap hook, fold it over, and match up your holes. If you're using a rivet with a cap that is wider than 8 millimeter, you may need to adjust the distance between these holes so that your rivet press can comfortably compress them without denting the other rivet right next to it. So I'm going to go ahead and press these and then we're done. Okay, my rivets are installed all the way, and all I need to do is do some edge coating on that and that one right there, and then clip them on the bag, and you have then finished your Gaia Crossbody bag. Thanks for watching, and if you bought the pattern and you have made one, thank you for supporting me in my business, and happy sewing. Bye.